Are you all ready to join me today in our trip to outer space?
Come along quietly or not.
I will talk to you of art, for there is nothing else. Some artist made a hook. Yes. Bite upon it.
Classy. And now, without further ado,
You, go back a long time, old man.
Old men always do.
Ran with the Guineas, back when the Guineas were tough.
I ran when I could.
Look good doing it, too.
I'm no help to you. My tailor's dead.
Hello, folks, and welcome to another episode of the Planet Shivers podcast. I am Albert Shivers, and on this episode, it's a good one today. It's a real nice little good episode. We got Don Wilson and Isaac Wilson back on the show. Don Wilson's got lots more to talk about in his fourth visit to the show, and I'm very excited. Before you get all crazy, though, this was recorded pre-corona, so don't go nutty on me. Right now, as a matter of fact, Don Wilson is working on a mural down in Easton, and I'll get you more information on that in a bit. Before we get into the episode, though, I want to talk about a little somber note here, a little bit of a somber note I got yesterday, was that jazz dancer and singer Mable Lee died at 97 years old. Mable Lee was known as the queen of the soundies. So soundies were like short music videos of the 30s and 40s, into the 50s a little bit. And they were either played one of two ways. They were either shown before and in the middle or after films at a movie theater, or they were originally intended to be used on video jukeboxes. Now, video jukeboxes are not really too known about, and they were more popular at the time in England. So imagine a jukebox, and rather than having the 45s in it, this had a bunch of 16 millimeter films, and somehow the mechanics of the machinery could play the film, and you'd be able to stand there and look at a video play right in front of you. These video jukeboxes were not that popular in the States. They were more popular in Europe, mainly the UK, but there were thousands of these soundies. And at first, the big musicians, Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, Ella Fitzgerald, the singers, were all leery to do this. You know, it was a new technology. They were all a little leery to take part in it. So what it ended up doing was boosting up lesser-known big bands who didn't feel they had anything to lose by doing a video. Well, Mable Lee, again, she did over 100 soundies, whether it was being a featured dancer, featured singer and dancer, or just being in the chorus line in the back. She always stood out. If you're YouTubing this episode of the podcast, I'm going to put links to some of Mable Lee's videos in the description below. This way you can go check out her work. I learned about her through a DVD that I picked up called Half Past Jump Time, which is a DVD compilation of all these old jazz soundies. And she's all over the DVD. And she was very popular amongst the circles. She worked with everybody from Duke Ellington, Johnny Hodges, Count Basie, the main guy, Louis Jordan, who put her in some films of his. Mainly the film, I think it was 1947, Reet, Petite, and Gone. She also was in a film called Ebony Parade, and she was on the cover of Ebony magazine in 1947. My notes have fallen here. A man is not a man without his notes. Anyway, but where this really comes into play, where I kind of come into play here, is before I was doing this podcast, I was trying to do another podcast. And it was going to be an old-time music podcast only, from the early 40s backwards in time. And would play the music and talk about the music, give some background, that kind of thing. It didn't really pan out. Became more trouble than it was worth, and I took a little breather and I started this podcast. Well, as I got rolling with the original podcast, which was called Roots Revival Meeting, I started to get interested in bringing people on who were either from that time, experienced it, or remembered it in some other way, or was an expert on it. Experts tend to be boring. I wanted people who had first-hand accounts. And in the research I had done, I found out that Mable Lee was still alive, living in New York. So a year later and a whole bunch of emails, because she didn't have her own email address. So I was doing all sorts of research and finding people who may have been in contact with her through dance halls and dance troupes. It was an email chain, I'm not kidding, that went from New York to California, New York to California to Canada, all the way then to Korea, where apparently Mable Lee was running or working as the head of a dance school there. So this guy in Korea has her phone number. I pitch my case to him about why I want to interview her, the whole bit, and he gives me her number. But he goes, look, don't tell anybody that I'm the one who gave you the number. So I said, look, I don't know nothing. I'll worry about it if it comes up. I take a day to think about my pitch. I call her up. She had a in-home caregiver who puts Mable Lee on the phone. Now here's where it got a little swervy, okay? Mable Lee definitely wanted to talk. But whenever it came up about being recorded, she would get leery. Now, I wasn't even pushing video recording. I was just going to go to her and do an audio recording. I was very plain with my plan. I told her about the podcast and all these different things. And we ended up speaking 2 times on the phone, about 40 minutes each, where she would just launch into these stories about her career. But once we started talking about when we could meet up to record, she'd start to back off. I even, in a last-ditch effort in the second conversation, pitched her the idea of doing the interview over the phone, but there was some reason why she wasn't too keen on being recorded, but was willing to talk to me a whole bunch about it. We had 2 40-plus minute conversations over the phone. On the second call, I did end up, the phone I had the ability to record conversation, but it would only record small chunks. Plus, I wasn't too thrilled about recording anybody when they don't know it. That's not the right thing to do. She didn't want to be recorded, so I have her saying, I think like just hello to me or something. And then I just exit out. I just didn't feel right. But I urge you guys to go check her out. In our conversations, which would take me a long time to cover, I don't want to take away from Dawn's episode here. So we're going to go from a jazz legend to a living legend in Dawn Wilson. And on this episode, which I am excited about, I'm sad about Mable Lee, but I'm excited about Dawn Wilson. We cover a lot of stuff in a short amount of time on this episode. We cover him, a little bit more of his tactics of being an art teacher. We cover the art he was doing when he was living in San Francisco in the 60s, which inadvertently, you got to cover the Vietnam War. So we talk a little bit about that. We talk about Don's interest in animation. Then we get into how he became a vegetarian, and also Dawn Wilson keeping an eye on the Long Beach Police Department. All very interesting stories, very fun. Dawn is a fountain of information and wisdom, and I think you guys will enjoy this episode. I enjoyed recording it, and I enjoyed working on it and listening to it again. I also want to thank Isaac for being on this episode and helping out with the recording. I hope you guys enjoy it. You could find this podcast and more, obviously, where you're listening to it now, be it a major podcast platform or YouTube. And you could find all sorts of updates on the Albert Shivers Patreon page and the Albert Shivers Instagram page at the little at Albert Shivers. It's that easy. It's my name. And I'm going to be doing more Mable Lee related stuff this week to kind of keep her memory going. I urge you to take a look at some footage below. And I even more strongly, urge you to enjoy this episode with Don Wilson. And I'll talk to you on the other side of it. So we could just start right now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so going back to my last teaching experience, which was in New Jersey, first thing when students came in the first day, I just asked them to look around and look outside, and anything that was created by people, it was either well designed or poorly designed. So I just wanted to make them aware that knowledge of design and cost factors and all that, aesthetic factors, were all involved in everything that people make, be it art or be it a car or a building. And I asked them to write down or talk about, and also write down on a sheet of paper what their expectations were in the class, what they hoped to gain from taking the class, whether it was one semester or a full year. And the other thing is the concept, as I think I mentioned before, the school community is made up of parts, and even within the school we have the English department, mathematics, and so forth. So the idea was I wanted to encourage them to, as much as possible, make connections with the other departments in the school. So for instance, one of the homework assignments I would give them would be to interpret a piece of literature, a statement or a phrase from a story. In the spring, the English department always put out a creative writing book. So the idea was that they could connect with one of the people that wrote the piece, whether it was a poem or prose, whatever it might be, and work with that person to illustrate it. Mm-hmm. There wasn't an illustration with every single piece, but that was an opportunity for them to actually have something be utilized. There's one thing I kept for the 26 years I was there. One of the things that I kept in the background and later as a course was photography. First room I was in, we had 2 enlargers, and I kept them in the storage room. It was a long storage room. So they were able, the more advanced students were able to use that and develop black and white prints. From that, I really encouraged them to learn silk screening, which they did, and also etching. So these are really important because then they would be free to give prints to friends,
right,
or sell them if they wanted to do that.
Right.
The other thing was, of course, then if we did batik, which we did at some point, where you're dyeing cloth and using wax resist, they could also silk screen on that surface as well as metal, whatever they might find. We started to do, toward the end, instead of using ink to silk screen with, we started experimenting with getting the right viscosity for ceramic glazes. So you could roll out a thin slab of clay and bisque fire it, and then the second time you would make that slab of clay the size of the silk screen. Silk screen goes on it, and instead of squeegeeing ink across, you use glaze. So what you had then was an impervious. Once it was fired, it was impervious on the surface. So we got to that. Besides basically drawing and painting, which are obviously very important, I try to stress perspective because that gives some authority to the drawing or the idea. We also did a lot of ceramics and sculpture, either wheel thrown or ceramic sculpture, because obviously some people are more adept at working three-dimensionally rather than on a flat surface. And so that was important. The other thing was, I think I mentioned to you earlier, was mixed media, because mixed media is basically encompassing anything and everything within reason. Especially if we started running out of certain supplies, we could use found objects, to work with. We did play sometimes, just purposeful play. So I would give them, especially beginning classes, I would give them a sheet of paper. We didn't use blindfolds, but we could have asked them to close their eyes, take a pen or a pencil. Pen worked better with their eyes closed, feeling where the paper is, anchoring it with one hand and with their dominant hand or non-dominant hand. Scribble for 3 minutes on the paper without looking at it, and then open your eyes, look at it, and develop it into something specific in the next 20 minutes, and the class would be over. So the other thing, I did challenge them sometimes with what I call drawing marathons. Very few people did this. It was more people who were considering majoring in art in college or in a technical school, and I would ask them to go home on a Saturday and just sequester themselves in their room or wherever they typically could do drawings, and just draw for 8 or 10 hours straight, and go out and use the bathroom or get something to eat. And a lot of them either worked on one painting or did a series of maybe 10 or 15 different drawings that may or may not be related.
What did you feel the benefit of that would be to a student to draw basically all day?
Okay, if you think about, I think we all had this experience where some people procrastinate putting off doing something that seems overwhelming, like a 900-page paper on a particular, or word paper on a particular topic. People would do that, for an English class or maybe a science class. So I thought, well, why not with art? Why not give it more credibility or purpose by just focusing on that without being distracted by other things? That was the other thing I mentioned also earlier about field trips. The important thing about that was not just being able to talk one-on-one with students away from the school. I could also see, once we were in the museum or craft show, wherever we were, what they were drawn to. So that was fairly useful to me, I thought. But as I said, very few people did that. But the ones that did do that, they were, I think they gained confidence knowing that by putting in that extra time, whatever they were working on was taken to the next level, or a few levels beyond what it would have been if it was just like, I got to do this an hour for the next day. It took it beyond that point. And I think that was important for them to understand that. When we did figure drawing, we couldn't do nude models, which is traditional in over the last couple hundred years anyway, actually back beyond that. As I said, I worked with the theater director. They had quite an extensive wardrobe of costumes and period suits and dresses and so forth. So I was fortunate. I didn't borrow some of the more expensive pieces, but we were able to borrow top hats and jackets and so forth from the 19th century or whatever period. And so when we did figure drawing in the class, it gave my students a chance to, in a way, role play, because if they put on a certain, like a 19th century Victorian top hat and suit, it made them kind of feel that part. And so I had that beforehand, and then so when they could come in, they knew they were going to pose the next day. They could put that on, and we could get rolling with that. So that was a help to have that. I did confront them with the videos that were being done at that time. You're considered, I think, you're considered to be an eco-terrorist and you could be jailed now if you were to sneak into one of the factory farms without permission and film what's going on there, the conditions of the chickens or the pigs, or
Right.
whatever animal you're dealing with. But in the mid 1970s and early 80s, the group PETA, the People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, were kind of routinely going in to these places. People said, "Oh, okay, you want to do some filming? That's all right. Just don't disturb the chickens and whatever." So I would show my students some of these films that they had taken, where hundreds of chickens were being mechanically killed, hanging upside down, and obviously a lot of people got upset. But this was in conjunction with the beginning of video classes that I was teaching, so it was relevant that way. It was cinema verite in a way, documentary filmmaking, and but I would usually have them just do a drawing related to that video, whatever reaction they might have to it. So I tried to do some projects like that rather than just dealing with traditional evolution of Western art or Asian art or African art, Native American. So the other thing is that, and they already knew this when they came into class, you could be very proficient as a drafts person. You could maybe draw very well or paint very well, but that alone was not enough. The technique was important, right?
Yeah.
But the other thing was the spirit. There's the spirit connected with it, and what direction is that going? Without the feeling, without the passion in the piece that you're trying to get across, the idea you're trying to get across, it's not going to be as effective or draw people into the image that you've created. So, I tried to bring that up as much as I could. And as always, they knew that they could stop me if I was talking about something, or if I wasn't doing a lecture or a demonstration, rather. They knew they could interrupt me at any time, ask a question, or refute what I was saying, or challenge it. I mean, that was a given. The general concept is that creativity flourishes in an atmosphere of freedom or liberty, such as it is within a school or a college. Right. And constraint or overseeing someone trying to create something generally has a negative effect on it. Not always, because constructive criticism can be constructive, it can be useful. But I try to keep that atmosphere going in the classroom.
Right.
And I realized pretty quickly I couldn't assume that when people got home that they had a place to actually draw or paint, especially painting, because the parents might be upset about paint getting on whatever, on the furniture or on the floor. So for that reason, I tried to, knowing that people maybe didn't have a place, whether they lived in an apartment or a home, I tried to let my classroom be the place where they could do as much work as they could in a 50-minute period, which is not much, because you got to introduce a few minutes and then just clean up at the end, 5 minutes. And so it's a very limited time. I was usually there till 6 or 7 in the early evening, and people came in after school and did work after school if they wanted to work on a painting or work on the pottery wheel. I kept the room open, unless there was a faculty meeting, which were Monday afternoon. So I just, again, I said before, but there were so many families in that community that I did rely on for a number of things, and they were always very supportive of what I was doing, and also the theater, the music department. They were always there. I think they still are. Maybe a generation, down the road, but I think it was that kind of a community that they were involved, and I wouldn't find out really what effect maybe some of the projects I had had on my students until after they graduated and came back. Whether they were working or went to college for a year or two, they would come back and visit sometimes, and they would come back so often and make a comment about a project that they did, like one particular project,
Right.
and thanked me for it, or said, that was really helpful. Like, in hindsight, I realized why you did it,
Right.
and maybe they didn't realize then why I was doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So that was good to hear. It was always good to hear from them coming back.
Hmm.
And yeah, I keep in touch with maybe 4 or 5 of my students right now from time to time, former students.
Gotcha.
So, but again, that's a few decades ago.
Yeah, and I could relate to that, just thinking back on a specific art teacher that may have had, like, who comes to mind when I'm doing certain pieces, who was kind of a very, very tough, she was very tough.
Right.
And I've gone to it a lot of times on recording, but she, I almost felt as if she had favorites in the class, and I was not one of them.
Oh, okay.
And maybe, maybe she's seen a potential in me that I wasn't reaching, so she was tougher on me. But there are elements of that particular, because I had her for 2.5 years in a row.
Right.
So yeah, like we carry all these things, and if there are lessons that I feel like our minds put on the back burner, and bring up later when it's appropriate.
Yeah, there was an artist who lived in Flemington. He moved to Philadelphia later, but I'm just thinking of his name was Leo Russell. I'm thinking of a print he did. He did a lot of silk screening, and it was a figure on a bicycle, 2-wheel bicycle, pedaling along. And on his back, he had this huge bag, which was kind of transparent, sort of like a giant Santa Claus bag. And it was all these images of people and sculptures and
Right.
events in his life. And it was called I Carry My Yesterdays With Me. And I have 2 or 3 of his prints, silk screens, but he started early on in New York in TV production. There was a TV show called Captain Video. It was a precursor to Flash Gordon. So Leo did a lot of the sets for Captain Video. He would do the background sets. And that's where he got set. But he was probably got some training and work maybe with the Art Students League. I don't know. But he was in his 60s, I think, when he moved to Flemington. But that was a great experience being there, because he would. His son Matthew was a musician, and his daughter-in-law sang, and so when he had art openings, it was always very crowded. He had the live music via his family, and it was a really good experience to just be there. And he would try to promote local artists, have a different show every couple months.
Right.
That was a good experience. There are people in the area here in the Easton area that are carrying that on, trying to, but it's going to be slightly different. It's never going to be, like it was, as they say.
Right.
I think life moves on and evolves and changes and ends and then comes back again in a slightly different format or venue, different feeling about it.
Right.
But yeah, there were quite a number of galleries. You were talking about California earlier. When I was there, there was a number of people that had galleries and kind of tried to have that traditional feeling or format for their openings. And part of that was, of course, to encourage people not only to come in and see the work or look at the work, but of course, to buy the work, because, even I know now a lot of the local galleries are charging 30 to 40 to 50% commission on work that they sell by local artists. And I think back then it was much less. It was anywhere from 15 to 25%. So
Right.
the prices were not as high then, probably, at least in the galleries that I was dealing with. So that's important that the brick and mortar galleries continue in some form or another, just like real books will continue to exist, as well as ebooks. They're not going to disappear, and that's a whole other issue, but it's related to the culture that we're in here now in this country and elsewhere.
So while you were out in California, you had your work in art galleries?
Well, because I was going to graduate school, full-time, such as it was, 12 to 16 credits a semester, I was also working part-time the whole time. I was doing that, maybe 20 hours a week, doing graphic design and that kind of thing. So I did make time. I tried to make time to exhibit work, and there was just 2 galleries, and I think I mentioned previously one of them folded and took my own work and work of some other colleagues. But a lot of the people, the number of people I remember that bought 2 or 3 of my paintings happened to be veterans, and they had recently gotten out of the military. They were involved in the war in Vietnam, and a number of my works then that I wasn't doing for the courses at the college per se were relating to the war, and so they were drawn to those subjects, and of course I did other things also. Was also attracted, as always, to the beauty of nature. You had to go out a ways from where I lived in Long Beach. Long Beach, at that time, there was a major Navy base there. There were, at that time, and still probably are, a lot of retired people there.
Right. And about what year is this?
1967 to 71.
Okay.
And there were a number of community colleges and regular colleges, of course, UCLA and USC in Los Angeles. Pepperdine College was in LA, I believe. Long Beach State, where I was about 20 miles from there. So I was kind of in 2 worlds, or really 3 worlds. I was quite involved in what was going on the campus. We had a number of really excellent speakers come to talk on various subjects that were current at the time. I had the work I was doing for a couple of companies, producing brochures. It was pretty boring work, but they were paying me to do it, and it was valuable experience. I knew I didn't want to do that kind of thing again, and I didn't for the most part. But and the other thing was getting more involved in protesting against the Vietnam War. A number of my acquaintances and friends were pretty heavily involved in that and organizing protests, and it got to the point where there were a number of major national mobilization against the war, it was called, and it's not a new thing. I know in World War I there was I was just reading yesterday about an Italian sculptor who came from Italy, and he got his start during the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s, which was very important because the government basically employed artists and musicians and photographers to create works in buildings, in sculpture outside of buildings. This particular person was opposed to World War I, and the government was trying to rally people to join the army and go to fight the Huns. And this sculptor actually cut off one of his fingers. This guy was a well-known sculptor. Cut off his finger. He sent it to President Woodrow Wilson, and he said, "I hope this will help with the war effort." He actually did that.
Wow.
So there are extremes. There were monks that were burning themselves in Vietnam because they thought nobody's paying attention to what's going on. Maybe this will
Right.
help. And so in with that going on, I was more over a gradual period of time, over a year, I was pulled more into that sphere, I think, into what I could do to help with that, whether it was creating artwork or making signs that could be put up in a public place saying there's going to be a rally or a talk here about the war specifically,
Right.
or civil rights specifically, whatever it might be. So I got more involved in that and kind of got pulled away, I think, from my purpose for being at the college. So it, like you were saying earlier, it's all grist for the mill. I was able to utilize all those experiences and share them with people and incorporate them in my art. There were a lot of people I remember in the area where I lived getting arrested, like especially on the weekends for being under the influence or using drugs in public or whatever. And I remember, a number of times these people I didn't know, I'd either be walking or riding my bike, or I'd be driving, and I'd see the police, pulled somebody over, and I would stop in front of them, not behind them, but in front of them, if I was in a car, and I'd go back, and the police would look and see me coming at them, and they'd give me a look like, don't get any closer, because they're putting the cuffs on this guy. And I would just say, and he would look, he would look, because who are they talking to? And he would look, and I'd say, can I do anything for you? And he said, yeah, call my wife, And he rattled off his number, and I go, fine, I'll call her, I'll let her know you're okay, but I'd say, where are you taking him? And they wouldn't tell me. It was Long Beach Police, so, she would figure it out. But there were things going on all the time. I had nothing to do with this, but there was a branch of Bank of America in Santa Barbara that was bombed. Somebody set a bomb off outside it, and the residents got very upset, of course. And so there was a lot of push and shove and aggression on both sides, I think. The people that were trying to bring attention to the inequalities in daily life or the waste of the war. So that was, a constant reality. Yeah. And then there'd be events like giant fires. I remember building a factory caught on fire about 3 blocks from where I lived. And I was out one night and I looked over and I saw, hey, it's not sunrise yet. It's like 10 o'clock at night. And I'm seeing this light coming up 3 blocks away. So I would go over and this building was totally engulfed, and there'd be like 30 or 40 people just standing, like looking at it. And the fire truck would be there trying to put it out. And that was incorporated into a drawing. I remember I did a drawing of that. I have to admit, I bartered with other artists for their work, exchanging artwork. I sold things very cheaply, like for $10, $15. Small paintings, just cover the cost of materials, that kind of thing. But I guess there was the community I was in and the people that I knew, that's where, it's not new, but the idea of food cooperatives were starting also. And so farmers markets within the city. So that was new to me. I knew where I had grown up there was 1 or 2, but that was new to me there. There were bookshops that were starting to open up, record stores, of course. So that was a chance for people to get together and share ideas and experiment with different ideas.
Like artistically?
Artistically and otherwise. I tried to avoid, I wasn't really much into drinking. I tried to avoid going to bars generally, but I would go if there was a local band playing, felt like listening to some music, I would, I would go there. And you never know who you would run into. Often I made a few friends that way. I got interested in vegetarianism through a couple that I met. I think they bought a print of mine I had some prints made offset printing style, and they had a baby that was about a year and a half old, and they were making a living catering parties from where I was in Long Beach up to Hollywood, Los Angeles. They would, whatever it might be, birthday party, bar mitzvah, somebody's anniversary, company party. They worked out of their van. They had a van, and they would cook a lot of the food beforehand, load it up, get their kid in the car, and take off. And so that's basically, there were a couple that got me interested in Buddhism and vegetarianism, and some other people too that were of a similar mind. And that kind of directly had an influence on my work, especially pen and ink drawings I did. So they were sort of like you would do automatic writing, where you just start writing as in a journal, kind of free thought. I let a lot of drawings develop that way, where I kind of had a general idea or a memory of a scene from a week ago or yesterday, and just put it, instead of writing about it, I would put it down visually as a visual image and just keep expanding to the point where it kind of told the story if you could figure it out. And then I would set it aside, done, and then do a new sheet for the next idea or next story. So those never were developed. They just existed as entities unto themselves. Done. Never followed them. I mentioned also earlier when we were talking before we started this conversation about animation. That was one of the things I was always interested in, and that was the first time I took an animation course, was at the college there. So that was very interesting. You know, we started out with very basic things, using moving a figure through a landscape, also having a ball kind of bouncing along with this figure, and having somebody on a bicycle going the other direction, and maybe the weather changing over a 5-minute film.
Right.
So, it was maybe 300 cells, 8 by 11 paper.
Right.
And of course, you didn't have to rethink the wheel. You'd have the last drawing. You'd put your next page over that. You'd basically trace what you had and then move something a little bit, because you would maybe film that for 4 frames if you're using 16 frames a second. So you could either slow down or speed it up according to that.
Right.
So that's something I might have stayed with if I had, focused on that, but I didn't. I did a lot of welded steel sculpture there too. And the main thing I remembered there was I really became very proficient at making color viscosity etchings. And the teacher's name was Richard Smith, or Dick Swift, excuse me. And he had worked with Stanley Hayter, who was a famous English printmaker, and some other people in New York. And then he was from Long Beach, and he ended up staying there and teaching. And I think he was the head of the printmaking department. But I was always thankful for having taken that course. I learned a lot. I learned about mainly about how difficult it is to make an edition of even 10 prints using color viscosity, where you're using different viscosities of the ink. The blue might be very oily, the yellow ink might be very dry with very little oil in it. Different rollers, hard rollers, soft rollers. To go into the soft rollers would apply ink into the recessed areas. The hard rollers with oily ink on the surface of the plate would reject the less oily blue ink, which would go into the recessed areas. Easy to do one print, but very difficult to do 10 or 15, really close.
Right.
So I always appreciated that, and it's probably one of the reasons I have my students understand etchings at the high school where I taught, because if nothing else, and they got pretty good at what they did, they would appreciate the process when they would go to a museum or see an etching in somebody's house. They go, "Oh yeah, I did that. And, wow, this is what I could have done if I stayed with it."
Right. When you were doing animation at that school, I'm just curious, did they have you do any rotoscope stuff, or?
No,
Okay.
if we did, I don't think
Okay.
I don't think that I did, because I
Okay.
think I would have remembered it.
Right.
Could you explain what it is? Basically?
So rotoscope was used a lot. I experimented with it
Okay.
a little bit. It was used by Walt Disney, and then later on popularized by like Ralph Bakshi, and it was
Yes.
the animation style of filming an actual person and then tracing over it frame by frame by frame.
Yeah.
Things like Snow White and Sleeping Beauty.
Yeah. Song of the South, I think they did that.
Okay,
Sure.
yeah, I haven't seen that one, but yeah.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
So I did like a 1.5-minute clip of like a jazz dancer because I was a fan of the Bakshi films
Right.
and
right.
wanted to give it a shot.
Right,
You know, like
sure.
just so it was fun, tedious,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah, that's it's good that you brought that up, because as in any college or technical school, there's not every major that's available to everybody that might be interested in something more obscure. So with the animation, I think it was probably something that was just starting up at that college.
gotcha.
Somebody decided to start that program, and maybe it was a year or two old. So they were starting at the beginning with what they knew.
Hmm.
And who knows, I'm sure they've included that long since, But thanks for explaining that. I'm
Oh.
aware of it. I didn't know it was called that.
Yeah, I forget it often, and then I remember, and then I forget again.
Right.
But yeah, it was a fun experiment to do. So were your fellow artists at that time, were they also doing a lot of like social and politically driven pieces of art, or at least
A couple of them were. I'd have to say I knew fairly well 3 or 4 artists. One had no formal training, but he really liked Vincent van Gogh's work, and he would copy his work. He would look at a reproduction of it and try to reproduce it himself. He was teaching that way. My neighbor for about a year was using various psychedelic and psychotropic materials, ingesting various things and smoking various things. And he was doing very whimsical work, kind of drawing from the interior and almost like cartoon characters, but within kind of a real landscape, I suppose you'd say. I don't know where he went from there. He was doing that for about a year, and then he moved on, and different neighbor moved in, who was not involved at all in the arts, but I'd say that there was a point for about a year and a half where I kind of sequestered myself from being influenced by other artists. I just was focused on what I was doing, which is kind of selfish in a way, but on the other hand, it really helps you to focus on where it is you're trying to go with what you're doing, what you're trying to say, and that was fine. I came out of that pretty abruptly and went back to drawing from life, really, with a sketchbook primarily. I took a lot of photographs while I was there also. So I had a 2¼ by 2¼ camera, and taking mostly black and white photographs. So I had access to a darkroom at the college, so I could make prints. I could work from those photographs to develop some of the paintings, and I also worked from some of the sketchbooks that I had. So that was, they were all important. And the only other really major contact was when we had openings with the aforementioned couple of galleries, 2 or 3 galleries that I was involved with. That was a chance to really talk at some depth, with the other artists. Right? Now, also, of course, at the college, there was obviously a visual art department, and they did have exhibits. So we occasionally would have, probably twice a year, we would have an opportunity to include work, probably one piece or two pieces, depending on how many, other artists were involved. And I think we had the option to sell our work or not.
Mm-hmm.
Most people did not opt to try to sell their work because it was probably part of a portfolio to take for job interviews, and they wanted to have the original work to show potential employers. Yeah.
Okay, was I right or was I right, people? That was a pretty solid podcast if you ask me. Look, you can check out Don Wilson's work at weetube.us/Don Wilson Visual Artist. You can check out Isaac's work on Instagram at when_in_zen. And of course, you could check out my work on my Patreon page and on Instagram at Albert Shivers. I want to really thank Don for doing this episode. It means a lot. We're going to have Don back on again very soon. And I want to thank Isaac for helping me record this episode. You can find this episode and more on all major podcast platforms and YouTube with video. Please go also check out some of Mable Lee's work, as we've talked about before. And until next time, take care of yourself and take care of somebody else.